So today we are going to discuss on three topics, that is the late intrauterine fetal death and the stillbirth. It's a green top guideline, and the rest we are going to be two nice guidelines that we are going to discuss today. So the most important and the first most that I'm going to start with is green top guideline, that is late intrauterine fetal death and a stillbirth. It's a green top guideline number 55, which was published in October 2010. So first of all, we need to understand the definitions, that what do we mean by stillbirth and intrauterine fetal death. If anyone has any problem with my communication, not able to hear from me well, or if anyone wants me to repeat in Urdu for you, so I'm more than happy to do that. The reason I'm speaking in English here is because the paper is going to be in English. So we cannot just ignore this thing, just to be on the fact. If anyone is having any confusion, please feel free to ask. You can stop me at any point of time. Okay. So what do we mean by stillbirth? Stillbirth, it's defined as a baby who is delivered with no signs of life, known to have been died after 24 completed weeks of pregnancy. Remember the word, after 24 weeks of pregnancy, a baby who has been delivered with no signs of life after 24 completed weeks of pregnancy. Now, what does IUFD means? That is intrauterine fetal death. It refers to the babies with no signs of life in utero. So intrauterine, the word itself means intrauterine, in utero. So death of the baby will be inside the uterus, in utero. While a stillbirth, we call it when the baby has been delivered after 24 weeks of pregnancy. Now, stillbirth is very common. It occurs in around 1 in 200 babies born. 1 in 200 babies who are being born dead. So this is a very common SPA. You will find it in the question books or even in the strategy, that this percentage, it has come as a single best question answer. So we need to remember this. Now, moving ahead, overall, 1/3 of the stillbirths are small for gestation age fetus, with half classified as being as unexplained. What do I mean by this line? I mean to say that 1/2 of the fetuses IUFD or stillbirth, the cause of the death is unexplained. In other half of the cause that I'm going to tell you in the next few slides, it says other half of the death is due to the suboptimal care of the patient, and 1/3 of the death are due to small for gestational age. I'll repeat this point again. A very simple point, that half of the death, that is 50% of the death, are unexplained, and half of the death are due to suboptimal care of the patient, and 1/3 of the death are due to small for gestational age. Now, what are the risk factors? That the guideline has told us that it has been speculated that rising obesity rates and the average maternal age might be behind the lack of improvement. A systemic review identified these as the more prevalent risk factors for stillbirth. In addition to any of the factors, the stillbirth often has been profound. So the risk factors for the woman whose baby is dying due to as intrauterine fetal death or stillbirth, the risk factors could be obesity and the increasing age of the mother. That is, if the age increases by 40 years, the death rate of the baby increases by 50%. If more,
Doctor, excuse me, please start the slideshow.
Okay. Yeah. Is it okay?
Yes, okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So the risk factors are the obesity and the average maternal age. When the age rises, when the age of the woman is 40 years or more than 40 years, the rate of the stillbirth or of the IUFD, it increases by 50%. This we are going to study in detail in the guideline of recurrent miscarriages, which exactly tell us what the percentage is there. Definitely we'll be covering in the module, in the early pregnancy module for that. So definitely when a mother who has gone under through this trauma, she is going to have the physical effects. The stillbirth often has emotional, psychiatric, and the social effect on the parents, their relatives, and the friends as well.
Excuse me.
Yes.
The first sentence that you have written, 1/3 are due to small for gestational age and half are unexplained. I want to know whether half is unexplained and half is, in half cases, cause is known. And among them, the 1/3 of the cause is due to small for gestational age. Am I right?
Yes, you're right.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Now, how we diagnose that that it is a intrauterine fetal death? So for that, what is the optimal method for diagnosing late intrauterine fetal death? Auscultation and CTG, that is cardiotocography, should not be used to investigate suspected intrauterine fetal death. Remember the word not. Now, to diagnose, what are we going to do? We are going to do real-time ultrasonography. It is essential for the accurate diagnosis of intrauterine fetal death. Ideally, real-time ultrasonography should be available at all the times. And if sometimes still we have any confusion, so we can take a second opinion. A second opinion should be obtained whenever practically it is possible. Mothers should be prepared for the possibility of the passive fetal movement. If the mother reports,
Ma'am, what does real-time ultrasonography means?
it's basically a type of ultrasound in which there are like the scan tells us the frequent values over there is mentioned. It's basically in the sonographic machine that we can see.
Okay.
Is this a special kind of scan? Like it's different from the routine scan like we do for this gross congenital anomalies or like the normal survey of the baby? Or is this it have a different specialty?
No, it's almost similar to it. Just it tells the settings of the machine, they are just bit changes. You know, that is not up to our domain because we are not basically the sonographers or the radiologists to deal with it. So
okay, like a consultant, there's some radiologist specialist and consultant domain is this?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So real-time ultrasonography, it is essential for the accurate diagnosis of intrauterine fetal death. It should be available at all the times. A second opinion should be obtained whenever practically it is possible. Mothers should be prepared for the possibility of the passive fetal movement. If the mother reports a passive fetal movement after the scan to diagnose IUFD, a repeat scan should be offered. So if there is any element of passive fetal movement, we can request for the repeat second scan. Remember this thing that even after the scan has been done, we can still repeat on request of the mother, a second scan can be offered. Now, in the real-time ultrasonography, it allows the direct visualization of the fetal heart, but sometimes it can be technically difficult, particularly in the presence of maternal obesity, abdominal scars, oligohydramnios, but views can often be augmented with color Doppler of the fetal heart and the umbilical cord. In addition to the absence of fetal cardiac activity, there may be secondary features. Now, what do I mean by secondary features? I mean there can be collapse of the fetal skull with overlapping of the bones. Or there can be hydrops, maceration could be there. Sometimes there can be presence of intrafetal gas within the heart, blood vessels, and joints. It is another feature associated with IUFD that might limit the quality of real-time images. So what is I'm going to just repeat this point again. So whenever we are going, the ideal method to diagnose intrauterine fetal death, it is by doing ultrasound, that is specifically the real-time ultrasonography, in which we can find what we are going to find in the ultrasound. We are going to find that the absence of fetal cardiac activity will be there. Along with that, there can be other features present like collapse of the fetal skull along with the overlapping of the bones. Sometimes there can be maceration or hydrops. Along with that, sometimes there may be a collection of gas within the heart, blood vessels, or joints in the fetus. And sometimes there can be evidence of occult placental abruption, which may be even missed by ultrasound. So because of that, the sensitivity is very low, as it is only 15% for that. Now, what is the best practice for discussing the diagnosis and the subsequent care? If the woman is unaccompanied, an immediate offer should be made to call her partner, relative, or friends. Because definitely we are going to give her a very unexpected and a shocking news to her about her baby. So she should be accompanied by someone. Either it could be her partner, any friend, or any relative. Discussion should aim to support the maternal and the parental choice. Parents should be offered written information to supplement the discussions. Empathetic techniques, which can enhance recovery, can be learned and retained as a skill. Pregnancy loss can quickly result in vulnerability. Imposing care can worsen the psychological impact of the patient. Now, what are the investigations of the causes of late fetal IUD? First of all, before we do for any patient, we do investigation. We need to do first we need to take some of the history for the patient, and then after taking history, we go for the examination and then investigation. That is, we follow this routine pattern for all the patients in our clinics and wherever we practice this. So, clinical assessment and laboratory tests should be recommended to assess the maternal well-being, that is including coagulopathy, and to determine the cause of the death and the chance of recurrence and the possible means of avoiding further pregnancy complications.
Dr. Aksa, can you show me the previous slide, please?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So in terms of investigations, before investigations, we need to take the history, why we are taking the history and why are we doing the investigation. The reason is to find out any element of coagulopathy and to find out what is the cause of the death, whether the cause of the death which is there, can it be recurrence in the next pregnancy, in the future pregnancy? And if there is a cause we found out, then definitely we need to treat that cause so that it does not happen in the future pregnancy. Patient should be advised that no specific cause is found in almost half of the stillbirth. This is the same repeat point, that in half of the stillbirth there is no cause. Parents should be advised that when a cause is found, it can crucially influence care in a future pregnancy. However, the carrier should be aware that an abnormal test result is not necessarily related to the IUFT. Correlation between the blood test and the postmortem examination should be sought. Further tests might be indicated following the results of the postmortem examination. So along with the history, we need to do the blood test for the mother, for the baby, and also we need to do detailed examination of the baby that we call as the postmortem examination. Now, what do we see in the postmortem examination? We are going to see in the next few slides. Sometimes systems that use customized weight charts and capture multiple contributing factors should be used to categorize as late IUFT. Some tests may aim to identify the cause of late IUFT and so provide the answer to the parent's question that why it happened. 95% stated that it was very important emotionally to have an explanation of their baby's death. Definitely, if we know that what is the cause, that why my baby is dying, so most of the women, around 95% of the women, they were really emotionally satisfied with this result because they knew that there's a cause for that and it could be treated. That is why it's very important. And now, what do we need to ask in the history, specifically from the woman? And the important purpose of investigation is to assess the maternal well-being and ensure prompt management of any potentially life-threatening maternal disease. That is, detailed history of events during the pregnancy and clinical examination, specifically for preeclampsia, chorioamnionitis, and placental abruption. These are the three conditions that we need to remember. In history, we are always going to ask from the woman about preeclampsia, chorioamnionitis, and abruption, because sometimes abruption can be occult abruption and it's missed. That is why the sensitivity is very low, that is almost around 15%. Now, if the IUFT has happened, definitely there's a risk of the DIC as well. There's also a moderate risk of maternal DIC, which includes 10% within 4 weeks after the death of late IUFT. It is rising to 30% thereafter. We mean to say, whenever a IUFT happens, there's a chance of having DIC. That is, within the first 4 weeks of the IUFT, that the risk is 10%, and after 4 weeks, the risk rises to 30%. Please make sure that you remember this incidence. It has come as an SPF several times. That means we need to remember that once the IUFT has happened, in 10% of the women, there's a risk of having DIC, which rises to 30% after 4 weeks or 1 month. It rises to 30%, from 10 to 30. Now, this can be tested by clotting studies. How do we test for the coagulation or the element of DIC? We are going to test it by doing the clotting studies, the platelet count, and the fibrinogen measurement. We are going to do 3 tests for this. First of all, the platelet count, along with that clotting studies, that is PT, APTT, and INR. And the third one is the fibrinogen measurement. The test should be repeated twice weekly in a woman who chooses expectant management. Please remember, it should be repeated twice weekly if a woman wants to continue with the pregnancy. Although it is an IUFT, but she decides she wants to continue because she may go into labor by herself. If she says that, then we need to do her repeat the test twice weekly in a woman who chooses expectant management. An abnormal result might not be linked to the IUFT, but rather it may be simply an incidental finding. For example, the factor V lead-in is present in about 5% of the journal population and will often be as an incidental finding. So remember this, that factor V lead-in is present, the incidence is 5% of the general population, which definitely when we are going to test the woman, we are going to know. Before that, we will not be able to know. So we need to remember this percentage as well, that factor V lead-in, it is present in 5% of the general population. Now, comprehensive investigations can be important even though one cause is particularly suspected. With a very obvious cause such as massive abruption, non-lethal fetal malformation might be identified at the postmortem that would only be revealed when the baby had been alive or lived.
Excuse me, Dr. Aksa.
Yes.
I want to ask about factor V lead-in in about 5%. It's in general population.
Yes. It's
so
in
when
general
clotting
population.
studies come abnormal as a result when we do in workup, so then we do factor V lead-in test.
Yeah, when we have any suspicious, like when we are going to take the history, if there's any history of bruising or any history of thrombophilia, then we are going to take this in consideration.
Okay, history based.
Yeah, history.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Now, are there any special, am I clear so far?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
So are there any special recommendations for women with an IUFT who are Rh negative? Now, when the woman who is an Rh negative woman, definitely what can happen, women who are Rh negative should be advised to have a Kleyer test urgently to detect large fetal-maternal hemorrhage that might have occurred a few days earlier. So anti-Rhd gamma globulin should be administered as soon as possible after the presentation. So one cause of IUFT is going to be the Rhd negative. For that, we need to do the Kleyer test to find out the level of the feto-maternal hemorrhage.
And it should be given before delivery even?
Yeah, it should be given before delivery. We are going to discuss that. It is given in between 72 hours till 10 days of the birth of the baby. Now, if there has been a large feto-maternal hemorrhage, the dose of the NTD, Rhd gamma globulin, it should be adjusted upwards, and the Kleyer test should need to be repeated at 48 hours to ensure that the fetal red cells have cleared. Now, once we think that she is an Rh negative woman and we have given her NTD, we need to again repeat the test after 48 hours. Because why do we need to repeat that test? Because sometimes what can happen if the woman is less than 12 weeks, we give her 250 dose of international units of RHD NTD. But if she's more than 12 weeks, we give her 500 dose. So if we find out after repeating the test, if we find out that more of the NTD is required, that is the reason that we repeat the Clear test after 48 hours, just to know that whether she needs more of the NTD or not. Now it is
Excuse me, madam, sorry. Madam, can you please repeat those values of NTD? Like before 12 and after 12?
Yeah, before 12 weeks, usually we give NTD of around 250 international units. And after 12 weeks, we give it as 500 international NTD. Normally, this is what we have studied in the guidelines. Now, what happens if we have given the dose according to that? If she's less than 12 weeks or more than 12 weeks, we have given her the dose, and now the dose was not adequate for her. That is why we are repeating this test to see that whether she needs more of the NTD. That is why the test should be repeated at 48 hours to ensure that the fetal red cells have cleared. If they are not clear, we will again give her the NTD. That is the reason that we are repeating the NTD or the Clear test after 48 hours.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So it is important to know the baby's blood group also. If no blood sample can be obtained from the baby or the umbilical cord, the RHD typing should be undertaken using fetal-free DNA from the maternal blood shortly after the birth. So there are 3 ways in which we can know the blood group of the baby, either taking the sample directly from the baby or umbilical cord of the baby, and the third option is by taking the cell-free fetal DNA. There's a complete talk on this cell-free fetal DNA. Definitely we are going to discuss in the subsequent modules. Now, major fetal-maternal hemorrhage is a silent cause of IUFT, and a Clear test is recommended for all women to diagnose the cause of the death. That is why it is very important to find out whether the blood group of the woman, because the blood group, it is a major cause of fetal-maternal death, and it's a silent cause.
Dr.
Yes,
I want to ask, if we have to give NTD after IUFT, like it should be within 72 hours and up till 10 days. And we have to repeat the Clear test like after 48 hours of the administration of NTD.
Yes.
To check for clearance of the fetal cells.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So in those women who are Rh negative, the potential sensitizing beat might have occurred the days before the death is recognized, threatening the window optimal timing of anti-RHD gamma globulin administration. Ideally it should be 72 hours. NTD gamma globulin, it provides reduced benefit when given beyond 72 hours up to 10 days after sensitizing event. It gives the result is low, the benefit is reduced, but still we can give within the time period of 10 days. After 10 days, the effect is no more. So it's no use of giving that after that. Now, persistent positivity of Clear test is often because the baby's blood group is also Rh negative, but might occur with very large Rh positive fetal-maternal hemorrhage. It is important to distinguish between the two. The baby's blood group can also be used using the conventional serology on the cord blood. Typing with cell-free fetal DNA from the maternal blood is also available. So the same point is being repeated again, that we can get the blood sample from the baby either directly or from the umbilical cord or from the mother by using cell-free fetal DNA. We have 3 options. Getting the blood.
Dr. Please share the screen. Share the screen again. The screen is not visible.
Okay.
It's visible.
It's visible.
It's visible.
What we
It's
can
visible.
do, you can just log out and you can come back again. We are waiting for you. Yeah.
Raksa, I
Yes.
have a question.
Mm-hmm.
In the start of this slide, there is written that major fetal-maternal hemorrhage is a silent cause of and Klihar test is recommended for all who are RHD negative women. We will also do this test.
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Ma'am, from the start of this slide, it's written that major fetal-maternal hemorrhage is a salient cause of IUDF, and Klihar test is recommended for all women to diagnose the cause of death. It means that we will do this test, Klihar test, on RHD negative women.
It
Also,
means
all
that, yes, it means that we are going to do the Clier test on all the women, whether she is negative or positive,
okay.
irrespective of it. Okay.
Okay, and from what gestation we take late IUD?
Hamza,
Dr. Akshay, why we are doing it on all women?
Yeah, I'll explain you this point again. Like, irrespective whether the woman is negative, sometimes we don't know the blood group of the woman because she might not have tested it. So that is why it is very important, irrespective whether the woman blood group is positive or negative, we are going to do for her the Clier test. Because sometimes it is because it is a silent cause of the death. That is why we are going to check in all types of women, irrespective whether she is positive or negative.
But what will happen if the mother is positive? Klehor is only done for RH negative mothers to see the amount or like quantity of fetal maternal hemorrhage.
Yes, exactly. This is for the mother. But sometimes what can happen, we don't know the blood group of the baby. When the baby is, especially when the baby has been IUFT. So in order to find out that cause, because it is a silent cause of death, to find out that cause, that it may be one of the cause, just to find out that cause, we do in all women, irrespective whether her blood group is negative or positive.
Purpose of Klehor is not for sensitization, it's just to diagnose fetal cells in maternal breast.
Yeah, it is just to identify the fetal cells which are
Cause
present.
of death.
Yeah, to find out basically the what is the cause of, because if we find out, if we find out the cause of death in this pregnancy, so in next pregnancy we can prevent it from happening. That is the only reason.
Dr. Akshay, if the patient's blood group is known to be negative or if the patient's blood group is known to be positive, if it's known, then if in case if the patient's blood group is negative, then we are going to do Klehor. If it's known to be positive, then is there any need to do again?
Yes, still there is need to do, because sometimes the blood group of the baby may be positive, baby may be negative.
Okay.
Irrespective of the blood group, we are going to do this test in all the women.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Clear to all of you?
But if the mother is RH positive and baby is RH negative, this is not incompatible with life.
Yeah, this is not compatible. Yeah, definitely this can result in hydrops. Usually it can result in hydrops fetalis. That is why to find that cause, just we are to find that cause is the reason for the death of the baby. This is the reason that we are doing this test in all the women.
So before, if you want to identify the blood group of baby, so we are not going to do the blood group of partner first?
Yeah, ideally it should have been done like this. Ideally it should. But now when the baby has been IUFD, so what the guidelines say, it says to do in all the women, irrespective of whatever it is, whether she is positive, whether she is negative. Don't go for the husband, don't go for the partner, just go for the patient's Clier test, irrespective of the whatever the blood group is for her. Ideally, it should be done like this. First the mother, then his partner, and then accordingly the blood group of the baby should be done.
Okay, madam.
But these tests we are just doing it to find what is the cause of the baby, the baby which has been stillbirth or IUFT. That is the reason.
Dr. Aksa, what does this line mean? Persistent positivity of the Klehor is often because the baby's group is also RHD negative. Like if the baby's blood group is RH negative, So how come is the Clairol will be positive?
No, it means that the baby blood group is negative, but the mother may be positive. You know, it can be vice versa. Both situations can be there. The mother can be negative, but the baby is positive. But if the baby is negative and the mother is positive, in both the cases, we need to see the situation.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Now, what tests should be recommended to identify the cause of late fetal IUFT? Now, the first test that we all know is the Clair test we are going to do in all women. Tests should be directed to identify scientifically proven causes of late IUFT. Commonly, it can be associated with antepartum conditions such as congenital malformation in the baby, or there can be some infections in the baby like cytomegalovirus, syphilis, parvovirus P19, listeria, rubella, toxoplasmosis, herpes, Q fever, leptospirea, Lyme disease, and malaria parasitoma. So all these are the risks that can be associated. All the torch infections, they can cause congenital fetal infections. We need to remember like this. And sometimes there can be ascending infections with the help of E. coli. The group B streptococcus can be there, or along with that Klebsiella infections. They are common cause of infection in the developed countries. So in case of developed countries, we need to remember few causes, that is E. coli, Klebsiella, GBS, chlamydia. We need to remember these. Along with that, there can be APH in the form of abruption. Usually it's abruption. And there can be preeclampsia and maternal disease such as diabetes mellitus. The common causes of intrapartum death include placental abruption, maternal and fetal infection. There can be cord prolapse, idiopathic hypoxia, acidosis, and uterine rupture. So these are all the causes that we are going to find when we are going to take the history from the mother.
Dr. Kisa, all the investigations we will do in each IUD patient?
No.
We will, it depends on the history?
Yes, it depends on the history. And along with that, I'm going to discuss this in the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah. So in all women with IUFT or stillbirth, we need to do certain tests in all the women. That is the full blood count to see the blood, the platelet, because platelet is going to tell us about
Preeclampsia.
Thrombophilia.
DIC, the element of DIC, basically are to find out DIC, and along with that preeclampsia as well. Both are there. That is why we do full blood count in all the patients. The Clair test that we told before is going to be done in all the patients. Thyroid function test is to be done in all the women. Along with that, HbA1c, that is for gestational diabetes mellitus or diabetes, to find out that. We also do HbA1c in all the patients. And to check for the infections, 3 infections which we are going to check in all the women, that is cytomegalovirus, toxoplasmosis, and herpes. These 5 tests we are going to do in each and every patient. That is, I'll repeat it again: full blood count, the Clair test, thyroid function test, HbA1c, and in terms of investigation, in terms of infections, that is cytomegalovirus, toxoplasmosis, and herpes. Can anyone repeat these tests for me?
We will do full blood count to assess the patient for preeclampsia and any evidence of DIC. Along with that, we do Clair test for every patient, and thyroid function test in every patient, and HbA1c to diagnose for diabetes mellitus, and for infection assessment, especially cytomegalovirus, toxoplasmosis, and herpes simplex.
Excellent. Yeah. So these 5 tests need to be done in all women. And then other investigations will be done according to the history or the postpartum result that we find out. But these 5 tests need to be done in every woman. Okay. So if we look at this slide, that maternal standard hematology and biochemistry, including CRP and BISOT. The reason for that it is to find out the preeclampsia and its complication, multi-organ failure in cases of sepsis or hemorrhage. There can be obstetric cholestasis. That is why we are doing the bile salts level. For that, and along with that, we do CBC to check the platelet count to see for occult TIC. That is, we repeat the test twice weekly if the woman goes for expectant management. And coagulation profile and plasma fibrinogen is done to rule out the element of DIC. Kleyer test, we have already discussed that it is recommended, should be recommended for all women, not simply those who are RHD negative. It should be done for all women. Why it is done? Test should be undertaken before the birth, as red blood cells might clear quickly away from the circulation. In RHD negative women, a second Kleyer test also determines whether sufficient NTD has been given. So these are the reasons. That is why we do Kleyer tests in all women. Now, then depending on the infections, we may need to either do the blood culture, the urine swab, the midstream urine, vaginal swabs, cervical swabs to identify infections like Listeria and Chlamydia. If the mother has symptoms like fever, flu symptoms, abnormal liquor, or if she is having any offensive odor, prolonged prom is there before late IUFT, or we are having any history there's any evidence of pre-prom is there, or preterm labor of rupture membrane is there, or she is having any history of sepsis, then in that case we need to do the blood cultures, we need to take the swabs. So that is depending on the history we are going to do from the woman. Now, in terms of maternal serology, we are going to do the viral screen, syphilis screening, tropical infections, depending on where she is residing. And maternal random blood glucose, because to find out occult maternal diabetes mellitus. That is why we do HbA1c, because sometimes there's an element of occult maternal diabetes mellitus. In order to find out that, we do HbA1c. Most women with gestational diabetes may have a normal HbA1c. For that, needs to be tested for gestational diabetes in future pregnancy. It might also indicate occult type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Now, thyroid function test, because it can be occult thyroid disease. That is why we do thyroid function test by measuring TSH, free T4 and free T3 in pregnancy. And thrombophilia screening will be done if indication is there. If there is any element of placental disease, or if there is any element of fetal growth restriction. Most tests are not affected by pregnancy. If abnormal, the test should be repeated at 6 weeks. Antiphospholipid screening repeated if abnormal. For thrombophilia, let me tell you one point is very important with regards to thrombophilia, that in cases of APLA, first of all, we do just a single, we just do the screening, anti-cardiolipin antibodies, all anti-lupus anticoagulants. And then the test should be repeated after 6 weeks when she is not pregnant. In those 6 weeks period, she should not be pregnant. Otherwise, the result may not be as accurate as we wanted. That is why the duration that we are repeating the test after 6 weeks should be the period when the woman is not pregnant.
Ma'am, please, can you repeat this sentence?
Yes. In terms of thrombophilia, there are many causes of thrombophilia, but specifically the most common that we are seeing in our practice also is the APLA, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So what happens in this, we are going to, first of all, we have done a test for this in which we are finding the positive anti-cardiolipin antibodies or anti-lupus antibody. Then we need to repeat this test after 6 weeks. In those 6 periods, the woman should not be pregnant. Otherwise, the result will not be accurate. And we cannot start her on treatment.
Thank you.
Dr. Aksa?
Yes.
What is the use of doing APLS screen at the time of intrauterine fetal death? Because we are going to repeat it after 6 weeks.
Because first we need to find out whether there is something, if we are having any doubt, that is why we are doing it. In order to confirm that again, just to be sure that she is being diagnosed with APLA, that is why we are repeating it at again 6 weeks.
whether either result is normal or abnormal, we have to repeat after 6 weeks, right?
No, if the result is abnormal, then there are only 5 tests that you are going to do in all the women. That is full blood count, Kleyer test, thyroid function test, HbA1c, and infections, that is cytomegalovirus, toxoplasmosis, and herpes. Otherwise, rest of the investigations we are going to do according to the history of the patient, except for these 5 tests.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So there can be need for the karyotyping for the paternal because of the balanced translocation or mosaicism. So it can be indicated if there is unbalanced translocation, there is element of Turner syndrome, or if in the fetus, in the postpartum history, or she is having a recurrent miscarriage. In that case, we need to even do karyotyping. And if she is on any drugs like cocaine, then with her consent, this can also, the test can be done for her. In terms of infections, definitely we need to do these 3 tests, that is cytomegalovirus, toxoplasmosis, and herpes in all women. Rest will be done according to the history of the patient. Now, in terms
Excuse me, madam. Excuse me, madam.
Yes.
Yes, madam. Can you please repeat this karyotyping? I mean, when we will do this karyotyping, when we are unable to find any cause, or can you please explain this?
Yeah. Parental bloods for karyotyping will be taken to find out whether they are having any element of translocation or mosaicism. It is indicated when the fetus is having unbalanced translocation, when there is any element of fetal aneuploidy, that is in case of Turner syndrome, or in case in the postmortem examination we find that there is any history of aneuploidy, or there is any element of recurrent miscarriages. In this cases, we are going to do parental blood for karyotyping. Because
okay,
when we are going...
Once we have found any clue in the fetal karyotyping, then after we are going to for the paternal. Okay, thank you. Parents.
Yes, in the parents. Yeah, and this point we are also going to again restudy this point in case of in the guideline of recurrent miscarriage as well. And further the karyotyping, or we need to do the postmortem examination, that will be done if the patient and her partner gives a consent for that. In terms of postmortem examination, we can do either we have the external postmortem examination, that is, or we can do either autopsy. If the patient does not want like that her baby should be given cuts on the body because they've been any religious issue for them, then definitely only the physical appearance of the baby, or we can see just the placenta or the cord, can also be done. But the consent should be taken by the parents, and that consent should be written consent. It is very important that we take the written consent from the woman for that purpose, for the postmortem examination. Now, what precautions should be taken when sexing the
Dr. Aksa, your voice is not clear, please.
Is my voice clear now? Is it clear?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yes, it's clear, but in between it just miss.
Okay, if it's so, that please do let me know so that I can repeat the point again. Okay. So what precautions should be taken when sexing the baby? The parents should be advised before birth about the potential difficulty in sex of the baby, that is when appropriate. By sex, I mean the word male and the female, to find out what is the gender of the baby, that is either it is male or female. Now, to experienced healthcare practitioner, which could either be midwife, obstetrician, neonatologist, or pathologist, they should inspect the baby when examining the external genitalia of extremely preterm, severely macerated, or grossly hydropic infant. If there is any difficulty or doubt is there, rapid karyotyping should be offered using quantitative fluorescent PCR, that is QF-PCR, or fluorescent in situ hybridization, that is FISH test. So it is very important that we find what is the gender of the baby, which will be done by 2 experienced practitioners, which may either be midwife, it could be obstetrician, it could be neonatologist, or pathologist could be there. Normally, it is very easy to identify the gender of the baby, but sometimes it can be difficult when the baby is extremely premature, severely if the baby is macerated, or is having gross hydrop infants. To find out what is the cause of what is the sex of the baby, we need to do. Sometimes we may not be able to find it by on physical appearance of the baby by inspection. For that is why we need then help by doing the karyotyping. Now karyotyping, it can be either done by using PCR or it can be done by using FISH, that is fluorescence in situ hybridization. QF-PCR with additional Y chromosome markers, it can provide a highly accurate result within 2 working days in more than 99% of the samples. However, sexing can also be...
Your voice is again.
Is it happening with all of you or is it with just one person?
No, ma'am, it's with everyone. At times there are pauses in between your voice.
Ma'am, I am unable to hear.
I'll repeat this point again, that it is very important that we find out what is the gender of the baby, whether it is male or female. If by inspection, it is normally very easy to identify the gender of the baby. It will be done by 2 experienced doctors, which could either be midwife, obstetrician, it could be neonatologist or the pathologist. But sometimes it is very difficult to identify the gender of the baby. That is, in cases of if the baby is very extremely premature, the baby is severely macerated, or there is gross hydropic infant. If there is the doubt that on inspection we are not able to find out the gender of the baby, then we are going to do the rapid karyotyping. In terms of karyotyping, it can be done by 2 ways. That is QF-PCR, that is quantitative fluorescent polymerase chain reaction, or it can be fluorescent in situ hybridization. Now, what is the importance of these two? If we are saying PCR, the importance of PCR is that it will give the results as quickly as possible, that is within 2 days. However, the other results, it take time. Only the PCR is the result that gives the fastest test result. Remember this point, it's a very, very important SPA. It has come frequently in the examination question that which test is going to provide you with the fastest results. So it is the PCR which is going to provide within the result within 2 working days in more than 99.9% of the samples. If these techniques fails, then sex of the baby, it can be determined by cell culture or at postpartum, but these methods can take longer. The shortest time which will be taken by any test is the PCR. PCR takes only within 2 working days, not even 2 complete working days. It takes within 2 working days. Remember this point.
Ma'am, if both are in options like quantitative PCR or FISH, then what we have to choose?
Then you have to choose PCR.
Okay.
Okay. And this is the question. Exactly, this is the question. So that is why PCR, it gives the result within 2 working days. If the general sex is not clear and the parents do not wish for postpartum testing in any form, they might wish to judge the sex themselves for registration purpose, perhaps based on an earlier scan, or ask the midwife or doctor to make a judgment. Other parents might choose not to find the gender of the baby and can give a neutral name. Sometimes the stillborn babies can be registered as having an indeterminate sex of the baby. Now, what is the practice guidance for cytogenetic analysis of the baby? Written consent should be taken for fetal samples used for karyotyping. Sample from multiple tissues should be used to increase the chances of having a culture. More than one cytogenic technique should be available to maximize the chance of informative result. culture fluid should be stored in a refrigerator and thawed thoroughly before use. Karyotyping is also important because it will find out the cause in 6% of the stillborn babies can have the chromosomal abnormality. So that is why it is very important. Sometimes depending on the test, we need to do the karyotyping because it is the cause which is found in 6% of the babies. Some abnormalities are potentially recurrent and can be tested for in the future pregnancies as well. Skin specimens are associated with higher rate of culture failure, twice than that of the other tissues, including the placenta. So the placenta has the highest advantage of being the most viable tissue and the most rapid cell culture, but the disadvantage is of maternal contamination and placental pseudomosaicism. And the next best test is the cartilage, that is cartilage of the patella, but cartilage is harder to sample. So the two organs that we can take for the examination from the baby, the first one is the placenta because it is the most viable tissue and it is a rapid cell culture. And the next one is the cartilage. These are the two organs that can be used from the baby. Amniocentesis can also provide cytogenetic results if the mother chooses expectant management, but patient acceptability and safety, infection of the amniocentesis, it has not been investigated in the setting. So this is not a good choice of the test to be done. Ideally, the placenta and the cartilage of the baby can be used for examination. Now, what is the guidance on perinatal postpartum examination for maternity clinicians? Parents should be offered full postpartum examination to explain the cause of an IUFT. Parents should be advised this postpartum examination provides more information than other less invasive tests, and this sometimes can be crucial to the management of future pregnancy. So it is very important that we do the postpartum examination. For all, and the option should be given of the full postpartum examination for the woman. But if they refuse for the full postpartum examination, we should explain to the woman that the test is done to find out the cause of the baby. And if we do partial postpartum examination, the test result may be affected because of that. So it may not give the 100% accurate result to us. So attempts to persuade parents to choose postpartum must be avoided. The individual, cultural, and the religious beliefs must be respected. Written consent must be obtained for any invasive procedure done on the baby, including tissues taken for the genetic analysis. Consent should be sought or directly supervised by an obstetrician or midwife trained in special consent issues and the nature of the prenatal postpartum, including retention of any tissue for investigation, research, and the teaching purpose. So the basic point from this slide is that ideally to find out what is the cause of the IUFT, we need to give the woman that she should go ahead with the full postpartum examination because it will help us to find out the detailed examination. However, if she does not agree, then definitely we can go for the partial postpartum examination, considering her individual, the culture, and the religious beliefs, but telling her at the same time that it may not give us a 100% accurate result like what we want to find out the cause of IUFT. Now, parents should be offered a description of what happens during the procedure and the likely appearance of the baby afterwards. This should include information on how the baby is treated with dignity and any arrangements will be made for the transportation. Discussions should be supplemented with the offer of the leaflets should be there. By postpartum examination, it should include external examination with the weight of the baby, histology of the relevant tissues, and the skeletal x-rays. Pathological examination of the umbilical cord, membranes, and placenta should be recommended whether or not postpartum of the examination of the baby is requested. This examination postpartum, it is done by a specialist doctor that we call as a specialist perinatal pathologist. Parents who decline full postpartum might be offered a limited examination that is sparing certain organs, but this is not straightforward and should be discussed with the perinatal pathologist before being offered. Less invasive methods include needle biopsy that can be offered, but these tests, they are much less informative and also reliable than conventional postmortem. So it is the same point that I'm again going to repeat, that the detailed examination or the full postmortem should be done to identify, to find out the cause of the IUFT. Ultrasound and MRI should not yet be offered as a substitute for conventional postmortem. It's not a substitute. Remember this. It can be used as an adjuvant or it can be used as a supportive with the postmortem examination, but it's not used as a direct method that it can substitute for the conventional postmortem. It's never going to be that. That is why MRI can be used as a useful adjunct to conventional postmortem. All practitioners who discuss postmortem with parents have a responsibility to understand the process so that they can give in the consent or fully understand what the procedure has been decided for the baby. It is also recommended that the consent form should include the sections, the purpose of the postmortem, why we are doing the postmortem, the extent of examination, that what are we going to check, what are the organs or the tissues that we are going to affect for the baby, and what should happen to the tissue after the postmortem examination, and whether it is going for the research or the education purpose. We need to tell to the parents everything in detail. There should be nothing hidden from the parents. That is why postmortem examination of the baby and the placenta, it has the highest diagnostic yield of all the investigations. Postmortem examination might reveal the cause and time of death. It will tell us the cause, the time of death, will inform discussion of relevance to the risk of recurrence and provide information for any medico-legal purpose as well. Now we move ahead with the period of the labor and the birth. Now we have find out the IUFT has occurred. Now how to deliver that baby? That is also very important, because we have taken the history. We have done everything. We have done now the investigations. Now how to deliver that baby? We are going to look at now. Recommendations about labor and birth should be taken into mother's preference as well as her medical condition and previous intrapartum history. Women should be strongly advised to take the immediate steps towards delivery if there is sepsis, preeclampsia, abruption, or membrane rupture, but a more flexible approach can be discussed if these factors are not present. So, to deliver for the delivery of the baby, individualized mother decision will be made. By individualized, I mean to say whether in the history we can see whether she had any previous cesarean section or was it her first baby. If she is having 2 scars previously, we may not give her the trial of doing induction of labor on this, even IUFT, because she is already having previous 2 scars. So that decision will be made on the individual patient. Well, women with intact memories and there is no laboratory evidence of DIC should be advised that they are unlikely to come to physical harm if they delay the labor for a short period, but they may develop severe medical complications and suffer greater anxiety with prolonged intervals. By severe medical problem or complications, that is the DIC. DIC is the major complications or the major concern that we obstetricians are worried for. Women who delay the labor for periods longer than 48 hours should be advised to have testing for DIC twice weekly. What are the tests for DIC that we do?
Fibrinogen and platelet count.
Complete blood count, platelets, and fibrinogen.
And
Yes.
clotting factors.
Clotting factors, exactly, very right. And it should be done twice weekly because we are monitoring the patient for DIC, that is why. If a woman returns home before labor, she should be given a 24-hour contact number for information and support. Women contemplating prolonged expectant management should be advised that the value of postmortem examination may be reduced. Women contemplating prolonged expectant management should be advised that the appearance of the baby may also deteriorate. Vaginal birth is the recommended mode of delivery for most women, but cesarean birth will need to be considered with some. So if IUFT happens, so the most recommended mode of delivery is the vaginal birth. But however, sometimes we may need to do a cesarean section depending on the woman's circumstances or her individualized decision. More than 85% of the women Within IUFT, they will go into labor spontaneously within 3 weeks of the diagnosis. Within 3 weeks. Remember, within 3 weeks. If the woman is physically well, her membranes are intact, and there is no evidence of preeclampsia or infection or bleeding, the risk of expectant management for 48 hours is low. Vaginal birth can be achieved within 24 hours of induction of labor for IUFT in 90% of the women. Whenever we do induction, so in 24 hours, within 24 hours, usually the women, they deliver. Vaginal birth, it carries the potential advantage of immediate recovery and quicker return to home. Definitely, once the baby has been delivered, there's a definitely by normal delivery, she can go back home earlier. She will be having quicker recovery as well, and she'll be up and about as well quicker as compared to the cesarean section. So cesarean section birth might occasionally be clinically indicated by virtue of the maternal condition. So depending on the maternal condition, we may need to give her the option of doing a cesarean section, but ideally the best option is to give her vaginal birth. 85% of the women, they will deliver within 3 weeks once we have diagnosed that an IUFT has occurred. If everything is going fine, she can, if everything is going fine and she wants to wait, then yes, she can wait for 48 hours or more. But if she waits, then we have to do the testing for DIC by measuring her blood platelet count, fibrinogen, and the clotting profile twice weekly. But if she says, no, I want to deliver my baby, so in that case, we give her induction of labor. In induction of labor, 90% of the women, they will deliver within 24 hours. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So how should labor be induced for a woman with an unscarred uterus? In case of unscarred uterus, that means that there has been no scarring on the tissue. Then how are we going to deliver that baby? So in that, we mean to say that the baby should be delivered by giving a combination of mifepristone and a prostaglandin preparation should usually be recommended as a first-line intervention for induction of labor. Can anyone tell me mifepristone is what?
Prostaglandin.
Antiprogesterone.
Excellent.
This is the prostaglandin.
Yes. And misoprostol is?
Prostaglandin.
It's prostaglandin
Even analog.
Yeah, even. So why are we using this both together, the mifepristone and misoprostol? The reason is that because misoprostol can be used in preference to prostaglandin E2 because of the equivalent safety and efficacy with lower costs, but at a lower doses than are marketed in UK. The reason? The woman should also be advised that the vaginal misoprostol is also as effective as oral therapy, but it is associated with fewer side effects. Now, the combination of mifepristone and misoprostol give an average duration of labor of 8 hours. The addition of mifepristone appears to reduce the time interval by about 7 hours. The reason that we are combining these two drugs together is because the labor interval is reduced by about 7 hours. That is the reason we are giving in these two drugs in combination. Now, what is the dose that we are going to give? You need to remember this dose. A single 200 milligram of mifepristone is appropriate for this indication. For the third and the second trimester IUFT, a systemic review found that vaginal misoprostol for induction of labor, it appears equally effective as Gemiprost, but it is much more cheaper. The average cost per treatment is also much lower for misoprostol than for prostaglandin E2. The use of misoprostol for induction of labor in women with IUFT has been told by the NICE guideline also recommends the same thing. Now, what dose we need to give? You need to remember a review of misoprostol use for the late IUFT recommends that the dose should be adjusted according to the gestational age. If the gestation age of the woman is less than 26 plus 6 weeks, before 26 plus 6 weeks, please give her the dose of misoprostol as 100 micrograms. Mifepristone will be both the same. That is 200 milligram of mifepristone we are going to give. Along with that, if she is before 26 weeks, we are going to give her 100 micrograms 6 hourly. If the gestational age is 27 weeks or more, then we are going to reduce the dose 25 to 50 micrograms, and it will be given at 4 hourly interval. Am I clear?
It will be making 6 doses then?
Yes, it will be making 6 doses. Yes, it will be making 6 doses.
And before 26 plus 6, it's 4 doses.
Yes, it is 2 doses.
Dr. Aksa, this is both routes, okay, orally and vaginally. We can give both routes, but preference is vaginal route.
Yes, why?
Because it's associated with less complications, adverse effects.
Yeah,
like
less side effects.
Vomiting and bleeding.
Yeah, bleeding, shivering, diarrhea.
Vomiting.
Vomiting. These are. And what dose are we going to give before 26 weeks for induction of labor?
100 micrograms 6 hourly. And after 27, it's 25 to 50 micrograms 4 hourly for 24 hours.
And along with that?
Is mifepristone.
200 milligram of mifepristone.
Yes,
200.
Exactly. So don't forget. Yeah, never forget mifepristone. It's both together. They will go hand in hand. Mifepristone and misoprostol. Together, they will be going.
Excuse me, ma'am. Mifepristone should be given together or 36 to 48 hours prior to induction.
There's nothing mentioned about this, that whether it should be given before, like how many hours before it should be given in the guideline. The guideline does not mention anything about it. The reason we are giving is just to reduce the labor time period. By 7 hours, it will reduce. Okay. Now, what are the adverse effects of misoprostol that we already just discussed now? That is diarrhea, vomiting, shivering, and pyrexia. And along with that, it is more common in women with oral misoprostol. Now, what is the best practice for induction of labor for a woman with a history of lower segment cesarean section? Before we were discussing about the normal delivery. Now we are going to talk about the lower segment cesarean section. So in terms of that, we need to know that mifepristone can be used alone to increase the chances of labor significantly within 72 hours, avoiding the use of prostaglandin. In cases of lower segment cesarean section, we can go ahead with the mechanical methods as well. But why don't we go with the mechanical methods in cases? Because it increases the chances of having the infection. That is why it is avoided. In cases of ascending infection, that is why it is avoided. Now, women with a single lower segment cesarean section should be advised that in general, the induction of labor is safe, but it is not associated without risk. It is associated, it is not, you need to tell the woman that if she is having a cesarean section, if she had a previous cesarean section, and we are giving her, inducing her, definitely it is safe for her, but still it is associated with some risk. What are the risks? Can anyone tell me?
Risk of uterine rupture?
Yes, very dangerous that we all are worried for. And sometimes even after giving induction, we may not be successful. The induction may not be successful.
Failed induction.
This is failed induction that we call as failed induction. So For that,
Risk of emergency cesarean section?
Yes, yeah, she may end up in having an emergency cesarean section. Exactly. That is why.
In case if induction failed, that you told 90% cases within 24 hours, there is delivery happen after induction. But if it does not happen, it failed, then should you re-induce or you should go for cesarean section directly?
That will depend upon the individual condition of the woman. That whether how is she responding to the treatment that you have given. Like how much is the dilatation is there, or if she is becoming septic, if she is going towards sepsis, then definitely you're not going to repeat the induction of labor again. You are going to go directly to the emergency cesarean section. It depends upon the individual patient.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So that is why when in cases of cesarean section, what dose we are going to give for oral mifepristone, remember the dose. In cases of cesarean section, we can either give 200 milligrams 3 times a day for 2 days, or 600 milligram can be given once daily for 2 days. In cases of cesarean section, the dose is going to be either 600 milligram you're going to give her once daily for 2 days, or it can be 200 milligram 3 times a day for 2 days. But if she is having a if she doesn't have any scar, she's been having previous normal delivery, or she's a primary gravid lady, then we are going to give her mifepristone 200 milligram. Along with that, if she is less than 26 weeks, we are going to give her 100 micrograms of misoprostol 6 hourly. If she is 27 weeks, 27 plus 0 weeks or more, along with mifepristone, that is 200 milligram, we are going to give her 25 to 50 micrograms of misoprostol 4 hourly. You need to remember these 2 doses. They are clear-cut SPAs on these questions, and you cannot lose marks on just simple questions where there's nothing like much logic to be applied. What do you remember? You just need to see the option and mark it.
These are the doses for the women who have no vagina, previous cesarean section.
Yes, previous scar, yeah.
And if there is a previous lower segment cesarean section, then we will half the dose.
We will have to give only mifepristone then.
Then only mifepristone. If she is having a normal delivery or she is a primary gravida, then you can give her both misoprostol and mifepristone. If she is having a scar, then only we are going to give her mifepristone, which can either be given as 6
no misoprostol. Okay.
No, yeah, no need for misoprostol. Okay. So the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada recommend misoprostol is contraindicated in women with previous cesarean section because of the higher rate of uterine rupture. The reason why we are not giving misoprostol is also mentioned in the guideline, that is the higher risk of rupture. That is why. But if still it is needed, that depending on the consultant usually, but we don't give in UK, it is not given. The mifepristone is given, but if it is needed, what the guideline says that it can be used safely at a lower doses for women with the previous cesarean section, that is 25 to 50 micrograms. But ideally in practice, we never give misoprostol for scar. We always give mifepristone. That is practiced in UK.
Dr. Aksa, for lower segment cesarean section, it is written in guidelines that misoprostol can be given. Greenhouse guidelines in the summary.
Yes, it is written. Yeah, that is what I'm saying, that it is you can give her, but if we give her, there's a higher rate of rupture, and if still the consultant wants to give her, then it can be used at a lower dose. What a lower dose? That is 25 to 50 micrograms. I'm not saying that it cannot be given. It can be given, but the consultant is the one who is going to decide for that. And if it is needed, it is going to be in the very low dose. That is 25 to 50 micrograms.
So, madam, if there is the scenario comes and they have the option for mifepristone and misoprostol, so then we have to go to choose the mifepristone, which is more severe.
Yes. Okay. And if the number of the scar increases, like if she's previous to, then definitely we need to always tell her that definitely there is going to be more chances of a scar rupture. The failed induction can be there, and definitely she can land up also in having emergency cesarean section. The number of scar increases, the number of chances of rupture also increases with her. Now, what are the considered suitable facilities for labor? Women should be advised to labor in an environment that provides facilities for emergency care according to the individual circumstances. Maternity units should aim to develop a spatial labor ward room for all the women with an otherwise uncomplicated IUFD that pays a special need to the emotional and the practical needs without compromising the safety. So in the labor wards, what happens here in UK? What happens in the labor wards? There's a special labor room in which all the women who have an IUFD, they are being delivered over there. They are being just managed over there in that room because they are going through an emotional trauma, and definitely when they see some other woman who is being delivered a live baby, just to prevent that psychological trauma that she may undergo, to prevent that. That is why we just have the separate special labor ward room for those women with IUFD. Now, what are the recommendations for the intrapartum antimicrobial therapy? If the woman is having sepsis, she should be treated with IV broad spectrum antibiotic therapy, including anti-chlamydial agents. Now, routine antibiotic prophylaxis should not be used. Routine is not recommended. Intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis for women colonized with group B GBS is also not indicated. If she is having any element of sepsis, then only we are going to give her a broad spectrum antibiotics. Otherwise, there is no need to give antibiotic. Infection is a common association of late IUFD, and the mother can develop severe sepsis from a wide range of bacteria, including severe chlamydial infection. Regardless of the cause of the primary cause of the death, the fetus can also act as a focus for secondary sepsis, causing gas-forming Clostridial species, which can result in severe DIC. So that is why we monitor the woman twice weekly, because she may develop the DIC because of the baby because the baby itself or the fetus. That is why we are always worried for the DIC after IUFD. So routine antibiotics should not be given, and GBS prophylaxis should not also be given routinely. Only if the woman is having any element of sepsis, then you are going to give her IV broad spectrum antibiotics. In terms of pain relief, yesterday, yes, Dr. Takwar, she did the intrapartum care and she discussed all the methods of pain relief. All methods of pain relief can be used. Now, diamorphine should be used in preference to pethidine. Regional anesthesia can be given. Assessment for DIC and sepsis should be undertaken before administering regional anesthesia, definitely. So women should be offered an opportunity to meet with an obstetric anesthetist. DIC, it increases the chances of subdural epidural hematoma with regional anesthesia. And whenever there's going to be sepsis or DIC, definitely it increases the formation of having more, it increases the chances of getting her condition more worse. In terms, if she's receiving any regional anesthesia, it can cause formation of abscess formation in the site of epidural. So that is why it causes epidural abscess formation. So if she's going to have any element of sepsis or DIC, we need to assess the woman by the anesthetist. The woman will be assessed by the anesthetist. Now, what are the recommendations for women who is laboring with a scarred uterus? Women undergoing VBAC should be closely monitored for the features of the scar rupture. Oxytocin augmentation can be used for VBAC, but the decision should be made by the consultant obstetrician. The consultant will make the decision if the woman is going for induction, that we already discussed this point before. The number of scar increases, the number of scar rupture also increases. Now we have discussed the part of the antenatal period in which we are going to take the history from the woman. And in the history In the history specifically, we need to know about her preeclampsia, about her if she is having any infections. We need to know about that also. And sometimes even after knowing the cause, sometimes we may not find any cause in half of the woman. And if we do find a cause, then if we don't find a cause, that is why we need to go to her further investigations that we all talk about. 5 investigations we are going to do in all women with IUFT, irrespective of whatever history she has been giving to us. That is the full blood count, Liar test, other is a thyroid function test, HbA1c, and the last one is to check the infections. 3 infections we are going to take, that is herpes, cytomegalovirus, and the toxoplasmosis. This we are going to do in the investigations. Then now in the labor, when she is having a normal delivery, what dose we are going to give her in case of in normal delivery? Can anyone repeat for me, please?
I'll repeat. In normal delivery before 26 plus 6 weeks, we will give 200 mifepristone and then 100 micrograms of misoprostol. It should be given 6 hourly till 24 hours. And in case of gestation age, if more than 27, then we will give 25 to 50 microgram, and that should be given 4 hourly. In cases of unscarred uterus, and in case of scarred uterus, we will give mifepristone in either 600 milligram OD for 2 days or 200 milligram 3 times a day for 2 days.
Excellent. Yes. Yeah. So now we have covered the past part of delivery as well, that how is she going to deliver. Now we move forward, that what we are after the delivery period comes the puerperum. So how are we going to take her in the puerperum? Now women should be cared in an environment that provides adequate safety according to the individual clinical circumstances. Women with no critical care needs should ideally be able to choose between facilities which provide adequate privacy. But if she's having any acute medical problems like after birth, that is, she's having any sepsis, preeclampsia, then the care need to be individualized. She may need either care in the HDU or in the ICU, depending on the situation of the woman. Now, what are the criteria for the thromboprophylaxis? Women should be assessed for thromboprophylaxis, but IUFT is not a risk factor for thromboprophylaxis. Remember my words, IUFT is not a risk factor for thromboprophylaxis, because this is a very clear-cut question in which they've given everything was normal in the question, only they've mentioned that the baby has been IUFT. So what are you going to give the thromboprophylaxis to this lady? There were all the options given, like low molecular heparin was given, warfarin was there in the option, and other was stockings were there, and the other option was that you will do nothing to this lady. So in that question, you will do nothing to that lady because IUFT is not a risk factor for thromboprophylaxis. Remember this. Heparin thromboprophylaxis should be discussed with the hematologist if the woman has DIC. Depending on the DIC, we may need to give her thromboprophylaxis that we need to discuss with the hematologist. Now, as she has been delivered, she may have problems with the lactation. So how to suppress that lactation? The first method to suppress the lactation is that we are going to give her non-pharmacological measures. In terms of non-pharmacological measures, I mean we can give her ice packs, she can be given analgesia, and supportive bras can also be given to her. These are the non-pharmacological measures. Now coming to the pharmacological measures. Now in terms of pharmacological, we have 2 drugs. That is the dopamine agonists. They are 2 drugs which can be given, that is cabergoline and bromocriptine. But the guideline says that cabergoline is more superior to bromocriptine. The reason why it is more superior, because the dose is single. It is only given as a single dose. That is why. Now what dose we are going to give her, that I am going to tell you now. We are going to give cabergoline as a single dose of 1 milligram Or if it is bromocriptine, 2.5 milligram twice daily for 14 days. That is why it is very simple to give her cabergoline, because it is as a single dose. There is no problem in giving that as a single dose. But if she is having any history of hypertension or preeclampsia, then dopamine agonist, that is cabergoline or bromocriptine, cannot be given to them. The two options for suppressing lactation, either we can give her non-pharmacological methods, and the other one is in pharmacological method, that is the drugs. In drugs, we have both options as dopamine agonist. Cabergoline is superior because the single dose has to be given, that is 1 milligram. If we are giving bromocriptine, it is supposed to be given as 2.5 milligram twice daily for 14 days. But it should be avoided in cases if the woman is having hypertension or preeclampsia. And estrogen should not be used to suppress the lactation. The estrogen should not be used to suppress the lactation. Am I clear so far?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So now coming over, all the keywords, who should be informed that an IUFT has happened? All the key staff responsible for the care of the woman during pregnancy and afterwards should be informed of the events. All existing appointments should be cancelled. The maternity unit should keep a list of the likely departments that need to be contacted. Now, in terms of physiological support to the woman, because she has undergone so much trauma that she may need support. She may have, because of the psychological situation that she is going through, she is going through post-traumatic stress disorder, but their reactions may be very different. Sometimes what can happen that 40% of the couples, they may have a high risk of dissolving because of the stillbirth. The 40% of the couples, they may end up just because of the stillbirth babies in UK. It's quite high percent. Now, what is the best practice for use of interventions that may aid psychological recovery? The carriers should be aware of and responsive to possible variations in the individual and cultural approaches to the death. Counseling should be offered to all women along with their parents, like their family members, including if they are having any other child or the grandparents are there, they should also be considered for counseling. Debriefing services must not care for women with symptoms of psychiatric disease in isolation. The parents should be advised about support groups. Bereavement officers should be appointed to coordinate the services. So after the delivery, it is very important to provide support to the woman, not only to the woman, to her partner, and if she is having any other child, that should also be given the support, or any other family members should also be given the support. Now, what is the evidence of seeing, holding, and naming of the babies or the mementos of the baby? The carrier should avoid persuading parents to have contact with their stillborn baby, but it should strongly support such as desires when they express. When they want to meet their baby, they want to name their baby, they want to have the photographs of the baby or the mementos, definitely the parents have the right to do that. Parents who are considered naming their baby should be advised that after registering, a name cannot be entered at a later date, nor it can be changed. If parents do decide to name their baby, the carrier should use the name, including at the follow-up meetings. Parents should be offered but not persuaded to retain artifacts of remembrance, that is, mementos, photographs, footprints, hair, or frames, photo frames, whatever they're happy with, they can go ahead with. Verbal consent should be sought from the parents, and information clinical governance should be compiled with for the clinical photography. If the parents do not wish to have mementos, staff should order to store them securely in the maternal case record for future access. It should be explained that clothes on a macerated baby might become stained. Well, now, once the baby has been delivered, she has all the size of support. We discussed about the delivery plan. Also, what about the lactation? We have discussed the thromboprophylaxis. Now, once the baby has been delivered, now we need to know about the birth, like whether a birth certificate has to be formed or what are the legal implications for that. So what does the guideline say with regards to that? The following clinical practice guidance is derived from the statute and the code of practice. The stillbirth must medically be certified by a fully registered doctor or a midwife. The doctor or midwife must have been present at the time of the birth, or they've examined the baby after the birth. The coroner, the HM coroner, must be contacted if there is any doubt about the status of the baby. Police should be contacted if there is any suspicion of deliberate action to cause the stillbirth. Fetal death delivered later than 24 weeks that had cleared occurred and before the end of the 24 weeks do not have to be certified or registered. Remember this very important point, that if the baby has died before 24 weeks, we don't need to go for any registration or medical certification of a stillbirth. If the baby is born after 24 weeks, then definitely we need to go for the certification of the stillbirth. The baby can be registered. If the baby does not have any, we don't know, we are still not sure about the sex of the baby, then it can be written as the indeterminate sex awaiting for the further test. Now the parents are responsible in law for registrating the birth, but they can delegate the task to a healthcare professional. Either the parents can do this by themselves for the stillbirth, for the medical certificate, or the doctor can even help them also to do with it. The mother or the father, if the couple, they were married at the time of the birth, the registration process, that is the stillbirth, it should normally be done within 42 days. That is 21 days in Scotland, but with a final limit of 3 months for the exceptional circumstances. Ideally, it should be done within 42 days, but once the final limit of 3 months is there, but if there is any exceptional reason, then a time period of 3 months is also available. But ideally, it should be done within 42 days. This responsibility can be delegated to healthcare professionals, including a midwife or doctor present at the birth or the bereavement support officer. The person who is registering the birth has been able to provide the following. That is, what is the place of the birth of the baby, what is the date of the birth of the baby, if they have named the baby, so what is the name and the surname of the baby, and what is the gender of the baby. And if we don't know, we are not sure about the gender of the baby, we will write it as indeterminate sex of the baby. And the names, surnames, place of birth, and occupation of the parents should also be given, along with the mother's maiden name if applicable. In Scotland, the marriage certificate of the parents is also required. The register of the birth will meet with the parents in private. The birth is entered on the stillbirth register, which is separate from the standard birth of registers. The parents are then issued with a certificate of a stillbirth and the documentation for burial or cremation. A certificate of cremation cannot be issued before the registration. Remember this thing. First, we need to form always the certificate of the baby will be formed for the stillbirth, and then the form will be given for cremation or the burial purpose. But that we've all discussed so far is the parents, they are married. They are the mother and father of the baby. But if it is a couple who is not married, then how are they going to do? The father details can be added only if one of the following is filled. The mother and the father, they go to the register office together and they sign in the stillbirth register together. Or if the father is unable to go to the register office with the mother, the father may take a statutory declaration acknowledging that he is the father, with the mother must produce to the register. That if the father is not able to go and only the mother goes, then father should give any evidence that he is the father of this child. And same goes for the mother as well. If the mother is not able to go, only the father goes, then the mother should give some evidence that she is the mother of this baby, just to be entered into the register. So I will just repeat this point because it's a little bit difficult. So in terms of medical certification for the baby, ideally the certified baby, it should be done if the baby is born after 24 weeks. Before 24 weeks, there is no need for any registration or formation of medical certificate. After 24 weeks, definitely we need to form the certificate of the baby. In the certificate, we are going to mention the place of the birth of the baby, date of the birth of the baby, and name of the baby. Along with that, if the gender of the baby is not known, then we can write in that as an indeterminate sex. And this all should be done ideally, certificate process, it should be done within 42 days. But if there is any exceptional circumstances, then the limit is within 3 months. Now, if the couples are not married, they're just only, if they're not married, then either they should go together. Both the partners, they should go to the office together and sign the stillbirth. Or if only the father goes and the mother is not there, then mother needs to give her proof that she is the mother of that child. But only if the mother goes and the father does not go, then father has to give that declaration that he is the father, or the paternity of his father should be shown for the court purposes. Am I clear for you all? It's a little bit confusing. Not confusing, but because it's a law of UK, so we need to understand just this thing because we are not practicing in our countries. That is why. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, you have to mug it up.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely. Yeah. Once you revise it again and again, yeah, it will come up into your mind. Now, what are the recommendations for the spiritual guidance, burial, cremation, and the remembrance? As we already discussed. I'm so sorry, I can't hear your voice.
I request you one, if you don't mind.
I'm so
Sir,
sorry.
I was just telling you, if you barge words means the most significant. Can you hear me? Okay, you carry on. After that, we can discuss.
All right. Okay. Yeah. But don't forget to discuss. Yeah, definitely after that, we are going to discuss here. Yeah. So maternity unit, they should have arrangement with the elders of all common faiths and non-ritual spiritual organization as a source of guidance and support for the parents. The legal responsibility for the child's body's rest with the parents can be determined. They should be allowed to choose what are the funeral services they are going to do. Either they are going to bury the baby or they are going to do the cremation of the baby. That is the religion differences. And either they want to keep the toys of the baby, the pictures, or anything they need to keep as a mementos. That is the parents' wishes. Now, what advice should be given about the fertility? It's the important part now. So information about the fertility.
Sorry, madam. Can you please the previous slide?
Yes. Don't worry, you'll be getting all of you will be getting the PDF of this, so you don't need to get for the screenshot. Don't worry about those.
If you get the PDF, it will be more
yeah, definitely. We are working on that, so you'll definitely be getting it soon. So in terms of fertility,
Dr. Aksa, is it possible that we can get the PDF before your lecture so that we can go through it, and when you are delivering it, our concepts are more clearer than before?
Okay, the admin is here with us with regards to this. The admin, definitely be all mentors. We can sit with the admin and talk about this, because definitely once it is better, what I will suggest as a student, because I am also being a student phase also, definitely we all are in the learning phase. So just it is better if you read once guideline, because you know an idea that you have gone through the guideline. And then after you read only these slides, it is enough, more than enough, because we are not leaving any single points that means that you need to go back to the guideline. So now in terms of fertility, mothers are more vulnerable to the psychological disorder when conception occurs soon after the loss, with suppression of lactation, because they are definitely she's not going to breastfeed her baby, so we are going to suppress the lactation either in the forms of non-pharmacological methods and in the form of pharmacological method. So ovulation can return as early as possible by day 18. Now in terms of follow-up, Once the result of all the investigations are there and the postmortem result is there available, then we are going to arrange for the follow-up. Ideally, the follow-up is done in 6 weeks for any medical condition. Now in the follow-up appointment, we are going to discuss with her that what is the cause of the IUD and how now we can prevent it if she wants to get pregnant again. How are we going to prevent it in the future? So parents should be advised about the cause of late IUFT, chances of recurrence, and any specific means of preventing that. Women should be offered general pre-pregnancy counseling advice, including support for smoking cessation. She should be advised to avoid weight gain if they are already overweight, that is BMI is more than 25, and to consider the weight loss. An offer should be made to discuss the potential benefit of delaying conception until severe psychological issues have been resolved. Carriers should be aware that while mothers tend to experience a greater anxiety when conception occurs soon after a fetal loss, the partners are more likely to suffer anxiety if conception is delayed. Parents can be advised that the absolute chance of having an adverse event with a pregnancy interval of less than 6 months, it remains low and is unlikely to be significantly increased compared with the conceiving later. So definitely, in terms of conceiving, whether she wants to conceive, it depends upon the psychological needs of the patient. If they are both okay to continue, they want to get pregnant, definitely she needs to come for the pre-pregnancy counseling. And once she is in the pre-pregnancy counseling, we need to explain her the cause of the IUD, that whether we can prevent this condition and what is the treatment we are going to give her. And if she gets pregnant, she will be followed in the consultant-led unit. Now, pregnancy following an unexplained stillbirth, what are the recommendations for that? The history of stillbirth should be clearly marked in the case record, and the carrier should ensure they read all the notes thoroughly before seeing the woman. Women with a previous unexplained IUFT should be recommended to have an obstetric antenatal care, that means in the consultant-led unit. Women with a previous unexplained IUFT should be recommended to have a screening for gestational diabetes. And for women in whom a normally formed stillborn baby has shown evidence of being small for gestational age, then we are going to do serial assessment of the growth by doing ultrasound biometry. It should be recommended in subsequent pregnancies. Clear?
Ma'am, the last line is not visible. Please repeat this last line of the slide.
I repeated that if the baby is found to be stillborn, and we see that the growth of the baby is affected, that the baby is found to be small for gestational age. Now, in the next pregnancy, we are going to do the serial ultrasound to prevent this small for gestational age happening again.
Yes.
Thank you.
And ma'am, screening for gestational diabetes, we will do at the first visit or again at 24 to 28 weeks?
24 weeks. 24 weeks.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. What recommendations should be made for the management of future delivery after an unexplained stillbirth? Previous IUFT is an indication to recommend birth at a specialist maternity unit, that is the consultant-led unit, and previous IUFT which is related to a non-recurrent cause merit individual assessment for the place of the birth. So depending on the cause, we need to find out where she needs to be delivered. And it also depends on the gestation age of the previous IUFT, previous interpartum history, and the safety of induction of labor. So all the history of the woman is very important. And then according to that, we will decide the place of delivery in the future pregnancy for her. Now, what recommendations should be made for the maternal care after the next birth? Care should be vigilant for postpartum depression in women with previous IUFT. Carriers should be aware that maternal bonding is greatly affected. In terms of clinical governance, that definitely the midwives, the doctors who are taking care of the women who are having IUFT, they should have a clear-cut plan to that. How will they do that? If a woman comes with IUFT, what they have to do, they will have to go for the counseling. They need to give support not only to the parent, the patient herself, but her partner, her family members. This should all be in the written form. And once the baby has been died, it should be recorded in the center of the maternal and the childbirth inquiries, because what they do, they always work on, they are the people, they do the research, they find out that what is the rate, that how many stillbirths are because of this reason, are because of abruption or because of diabetes, whatever the reason is, they make yearly or 6 monthly, they do the researches and the audit purpose. So it is very important that it is recorded there in the data, just for the research and the audit purpose. Now, what is the best practice for the care of staff? A system should be placed to give clinical and the psychological support for the staff involved with an IUFT. Occupational health should be contacted for advice if there are particular concerns about the fitness to work.